I have lived with the name Felicissimo Dizon for the last 40 years of my life, primarily because my father, who happened to have been a private student of Felicissimo Dizon in the 1950s, is my primary instructor in Filipino martial arts weaponry. Felicissimo Dizon is a legendary Filipino martial arts fighter and instructor who is famous for not only being the instructor of the legendary Grandmaster Angel Cabales, who is the founder of Cabales Sarada Eskrima, but also being the training partner of other legendary martial artists, including Grandmaster Floro Villabril and the legendary Tatang Antonio Illustrissimo. There's a lot of information and documentation that we can get as it relates to the Illustrissimo system, the Villabril system, and even the Cabales system. However, much to my own frustration as well as my father's, outside of the direct transmission of knowledge that my father received in the 1950s as a private student of Felicissimo Dizon, there isn't really a lot of material out there as it relates to the curriculums that he inherited from Felicissimo Dizon, which happens to be Doce Pares, Doblete, and of course, Mohara. What I hope to do in this episode is, because of the growing popularity of Mohara through my channel, is to give you a broad perspective and overview on the man himself and his reputation and mythology, but also talk a little bit more on the three curriculums that he passed on to my father, which I have inherited from him, and he gave me the responsibility to now codify. Aside from my channel, there are really only four main sources that cite Dizon not only as a Filipino martial artist, but really as a kind of mythological figure in Filipino martial arts. The first one is Dan Inosanto's book, Filipino Martial Arts, where in page 35, Dizon is mentioned by name, but in far more detail, and later on in the 2000s, where Mark V. Wiley, who was a student of Angel Cabales and Tatang Illustrissimo, wrote two magnificent books that made mention of all three men. But these were the two books that made very good mention of Felicissimo Dizon and some of his biography, which my father had mentioned to me much earlier prior to the publication of these books. These two books, in my opinion, are great works as it relates to creating the connection between Felicissimo Dizon and Angel Cabales. Some key things that I do want to point out in the two books by Mark V. Wiley, which I highly recommend. Number one, it came to my father's complete relief that there was a mention of the so-called blind princess that Felicissimo Dizon learned his martial art from. Because, as you can imagine, as a teenager in the 1950s, and you are learning from a legendary Filipino martial arts master who claims to have learned his martial art from a blind princess, you'd have your doubts also. Thank you, Mark Wiley, for mentioning this in this book, because I promise you, when I shared it with my dad, he breathed a huge sigh of relief knowing that this story was also confirmed by another source. So thank you for mentioning that in your books. The second thing of note is that Mark Wiley mentioned in his books is that what he taught Angel Cabales from 1937 to 1939 up to the time that Angel Cabales left for the United States is that the primary art that he taught Angel Cabales was the art of de cuerdas, which from my understanding is a Filipino martial art that seamlessly integrates the coordination between the stick hand and the live hand in the same exact range, which I find really fascinating because my dad showed me elements of it, but he did not call it de cuerdas with my dad. He called it Doce Pares. This is a very interesting detail that he pointed out in his books. So the system that he taught Angel Cabales was de cuerdas, but the system that he taught my father was Doce Pares, Doblete, and Mohara. The final source that makes mention of Felicissimo Dizon is the magnificent book by Mang Romy Macapagal, who is the official archivist of the Cabales Illustrissimo system, and he makes very good mention of Felicissimo Dizon here, and one of the key takeaways is something that my father once again breathed a sigh of relief, because he makes mention of some of the more superstitious practices that Felicissimo Dizon was known for, which again, my father being a young attorney had his own doubts. And in fact, when he would tell me these stories as a young man, my father would always say, hey, take this with a grain of salt, because I'm not sure if any of this is true. The other thing that I found really interesting is that in Mark Wiley's books, he mentions that Felicissimo Dizon had a completely separate system that taught a Filipino martial artist how to walk around with a stick, how to sit with a stick in a bench, how to take a nap with a stick so that you were constantly ready. Although my father showed me some of these things, this wasn't something he enforced. However, I will add this detail. When I was in the 5th and 6th grade, my father made me carry, as a 12-year-old, 2 Eskrima sticks in a case. And this was a very interesting thing that he did. He had it so that he had something at the bottom of the carrying case so that it was uneven, so that one stick would be readily taken out at 12 years old. Here I was living in paradise as a 12-year-old going to school with 2 Eskrima sticks. So in 2017, when he started to show me some of the movements, I'm very thankful that he showed it to me then, because I think that if he had shown it to me earlier, it would not have made sense to me. And what he showed me all but blew me away. Not only was it strategically sound, and not only were the principles easily implementable, the biomechanics had a lot of intelligence behind it. And my father asked me, do you think this is something that you can codify? One thing I can point out as the primary theme of the Dizon methodology, as you go through the progression from Doce Pares, Doblete, and all the way to Mohara, a lot of your own postures and biomechanics relied less and less on the checking hand. In Doce Pares, there's a lot of reliance on the formulation of blocking, checking, and then hitting. Blocking the weapon, checking the weapon arm, and then hitting. This is still relatively prevalent in the Doce Pares system. But once you move on to the Doblete system, there was a lot less reliance on the checking hand and a greater emphasis on precision striking, because the principal strategy of the Doblete system is to finish the opponent in 3 strikes. By the time you've graduated to the Mohara system, there is very little use, if any, of the checking hand. What the checking hand is now being used for is how to manipulate it so that you're taking the weapon from your right hand and then switching it over to your left, or you are using the Dagdag Bawas methodology, wherein you are going to change the distance of the stick and use it as a power assist to use either two-handed like a sword or two-handed like a jo. I really hope you enjoyed this video, which is a broad overview of the Dizon methodology as that knowledge was transmitted to my father and then to me, the Dizon methodologies of Doce Pares, Doblete, and Mohara. Thank you for letting me share, and I hope you enjoy this video.
Let's first take a look at a typical guard of a Filipino martial artist who happens to be in the beginner and intermediate ranges of their development. There's going to be a lot of busy movement, a lot of rocking back and forth, and an over-reliance on athleticism with little understanding on positional advantages and angulations. This is the kind of guard that Illustrissimo, Serrada, and Dizon systems were able to take advantage of. The first thing to observe is the position of the weapon hand, which happens to be too low, which is right next to the hip. Hypertonic and inhibited pec minors and serratus are the usual culprits for this type of position. The checking hand is in a mediocre position to protect the thorax from any sort of strikes, and also in a poor position to take any sort of checking hand angulations, especially on the weapon hand elbow. The squared shoulder position is completely out of context here, considering that the hand positions are completely incorrect. This position is the preference of attack by draw specialists like Illustrissimo and Dizon and has no place within the arsenal of a beginner. The flared out elbows all but ensure that all strikes are not only arm-centric, they are going to be completely telegraphic. And as in the case of this poorly executed angle number 1, this is the first error from this position. Tatang Illustrissimo will all but tear up that brachial artery and everything in between the elbow and the shoulder line. Dizon will take over everything on the center line, along the neck and the head. And of course, Grandmaster Angel Cabales will zone out to the left and tear up that left arm. There's really nothing left for this person who is in this poor position. We see something relatively similar in this poorly executed angle number 2, where a checking hand opportunity happens on the headline, the shoulder, and the lower line all become available to all 3 Grandmasters. All 3 Grandmasters and their systems have their own way of dealing with this particular zone out angulation. Cabales Serrata with their lock and block, Illustrissimo with the checking hand, and Dizon with the kabilaan. Let's go back to that poorly executed angle number 1. As he throws his angle 1, I close the distance and check his weapon hand with my left hand. This then opens up his entire body to a rapid succession of strikes to the shoulder, to the head, and to the left arm. This is the block check hit methodology that is commonly found in Doce Pares as the opponent continues his reign of strikes. However, once you close the distance, you'll find that your opponent will use the same exact methodology and system using a block check hit system, where you are now both blocking and checking each other and your shoulders are squared off. If you are in close quarters and you're finding that your opponent is still able to launch an attack on you, this is an absolute no-no when it comes to Filipino martial arts and all types of weapons methodologies. This is more common than you think. In fact, we find it in the World Eskrima Kali in Arnis Federation tournaments all the time. Full body armor, close quarters, and squared shoulders in a rapid succession of strikes without risk of injury is not the kind of Eskrima that Felicissimo Dizon was interested in. The evolution of Dizon's Estocada methodology was aimed at addressing the block, check, hit formulation that he had received in his early training. The primary problem that he found was, although this was an effective sequence, he ended up in close range. What he wanted to do was to get rid of the blocking and the checking so that he could continually hit from the outside range, so that not only was hitting the prime directive, hitting was going to be the only directive of his particular system, with a specific focus on terminating altercations at long range, as he found that close quarters engagements were far too clumsy and inefficient. Let's now take a look at this more advanced player. By keeping his elbows in, he allows his strikes to be far more non-telegraphic and also more core-centric and powerful. The Dizon Doblete system hits his angle number 1 with a hit of his own. Instead of blocking it with his checking hand, he hits the stick with his own stick, creating a ricocheting effect, which then ultimately ricochets onto his opponent's head. The refined Doblete methodology takes advantage of principles such as interception, center line, and stored kinetic energy to take advantage of the opponent's weaknesses and openings. Taking advantage of the errors inherent in the block check hit formulation by using a 3-strike methodology using small circular biomechanical motions, or as he liked to call it, tick-tock-tick politic. I believe that his Doblete methodology was his pinnacle achievement as it relates to dueling one-on-one. However, as times became far more chaotic in the Philippines, he was finding himself matched up against multiple opponents who didn't necessarily use Eskrima. They often used two-handed weapons in order to facilitate their attacks, and he was finding that a lot of the traditional Filipino martial arts techniques, even the ones that he refined, were just not enough to withstand an attack not only from a heavy two-handed weapon, but also from multiple opponents who would come in at him with two-handed weapons like lead pipes. This facilitated his final innovation of the Mohara methodology, which has 4 curriculums: kabilaan, dalawahan, dulo sa dulo, and dagdag bawas, all Tagalog terms and with movements and techniques that have no direct correlation to Spanish martial influences. One of the important strategic innovations is, instead of countering his opponent, he would end up merging and mirroring their technique, so that by the time his opponent is trying to attack his right shoulder, which is now behind, the opponent's left shoulder has presented itself as an opportunity for a counter. By merging and mirroring with his opponent's techniques, he ended up taking away a lot of their targets and making sure that his own attacks are not perceptible to the opponent because his attack looked just like theirs. This, I believe, is what led to his reputation as a magician when it came to the art of Eskrima and Estocada. What he did was deconstruct the traditional methods that he had inherited, refine them so that he would remove the block check hit formulation, start to insert his own attacks earlier in the timing of the sequences, but in addition to that, he was creating more and more distance and making his attacks far more imperceptible while taking away traditional targets away from his opponent. So if we take a look at this Doce Pares attack, notice that he is having to step in a lot, even with his famous Doblete techniques, spiraling with small circular movements that were so fast they were imperceptible. By meeting his opponent's aggression with a counter of his own, he was still having to step in, ergo having to close the distance. What he found as a solution was the Mohara kabilaan, where he was able to maintain his position and his distance without necessarily having to give up any distance. He was able to do this with the kabilaan method, first and foremost by having an extended puño, and then by swinging at the opponent to give him a false sense of distance. That extended puño allowed him to then hand it off to his left hand securely, but with that extended puño in his left hand, he was now capable of reaching the opponent without having to step in. From the opponent's standpoint, this creates a very disorganizing effect because on the one hand, the brain is able to calibrate distance and say that the person is not moving towards me. However, the nervous system is telling him to move because every time he gets hit, his nervous system is telling him, you have to move. And so with the use of this kabilaan method, this, in my opinion, added to his reputation as a magician because he would seem to stand still, seem to not move, and he would seem to not be able to reach you, but then he would switch it to that left hand. Not only was he out of position for your weapons, he could hit you with his own. When we now move on to the dalawahan method combined with the doblete technique of using small circular movements to penetrate through center line, he was able to combine that with the kabilaan method. So now when he switched it to his left hand, he could come in with a very powerful strike. According to my father, this was his favorite technique when he was dealing with an opponent who simply would not go down. So this is a technique that he liked to use in his Juego Tudo matches, wherein if every time he hit the opponent, even though he got hurt, he was not able to drop him. And this is where the dulo sa dulo technique came in, wherein it was his finisher. Now when we use the dagdag bawas method, he could adroitly manage the distance and deliver very powerful strikes without switching his hands and not even taking a step. He was able to achieve this by innovating an intuitive template of anatomical indices wherein he uses his own anatomy to re-grip the stick and change the distance of the altercation without having to take an extra step. This is my favorite curriculum in the entire Mohara methodology simply because it is the greatest test of my understanding of distance, posture, timing, and angulation. But in addition to that, it introduced me to the kalahati grip, wherein I grip the stick in the middle section so I can interchange both top and bottom positions for offensive and defensive applications. This, by far, in my opinion, is his most innovative curriculum and something that I have never seen in any other Filipino martial arts curriculum or methodology. That said, I believe that the true genius of Felicissimo Dizon can only be appreciated by showing all three systems together in movement and in tandem: Doce Pares, Doblete, and Mohara. This is the first time I have ever put this together for public consumption. My plan going forward is to not only build hub content for Felicissimo Dizon's fighting systems on my Estocada channel, but also to create an entire platform for it in terms of books and online instruction. That said, I really hope you enjoyed this video and appreciate Felicissimo Dizon and his entire Estocada methodology. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.